Well, thanks very much, Chris, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. The topic today is, did the military intervention in Libya succeed? So what is success? I actually read Chris's book, and I'm not sure that it ever formally defined what success is, yet it concluded that the Libya intervention was a success, and so I assume he'll be telling us today what he meant precisely by that. For me, when I think of success in a military campaign, I turn for guidance to Clausewitz, the most famous theorist of the use of military force in history, and his most famous dictum, which is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Now, most people have heard that, maybe even can recite it, but not that many people think about what it actually means. And what it means is that when you conduct a war, success is determined not by the military achievements, but by the political achievements. That is success. So specifically in this use of force, in this military campaign against Libya, what was the political objective that would help us decide if there was success or not? Well, fortunately, President Obama told us what the political objectives were, and he told us barely a week into the intervention in a speech appropriately at the National Defense University. And what he said is that the goals were, political goals were: 1, to protect civilians; 2, to stop the killing; 3, to facilitate a transition to a legitimate government that is responsive to the Libyan people; 4th, avert strains on the peaceful yet fragile transition in neighboring states, that is the nascent Arab Spring; and lastly, to prevent repressive leaders in other states from concluding that violence is the best strategy to cling to power. So success would be achieving these political objectives, or at least making progress towards these political objectives at a cost that is worthwhile. Okay? So that would be what success is. Now the question is, did we achieve success? And the way to assess that is to compare what actually happened with intervention to what would have happened without intervention. Then we can see what the net impact of intervention was. So first, well, what would have happened without intervention? It's impossible to know for sure. This is what we call a counterfactual, but there's good ways of assessing it. And what we have to do is look at what was happening immediately prior to intervention and what likely would have occurred without the intervention. So we have to go into the beginnings of this conflict and how it transpired prior to NATO intervention. So what was happening in Libya? One thing that was not happening in Libya is that there were no massacres of nonviolent civilian protesters. I'm sure you've all heard there were, but in fact there were not. And if you want documentation of that, just read my article published in International Security last year. So what was happening? Well, there was a violent uprising in Libya. It was violent from the very first day. It was in eastern Libya, a traditional opposition area to Gaddafi's rule. Gaddafi initially responded with non-lethal force, but very, very quickly, both sides escalated to lethal force within days. The rebels then made fairly rapid progress. So this was the uprising in the east in those middle days of February, and within about 2 weeks, the rebels had moved westward and conquered the eastern half, the coast of Libya. And then there had been uprisings afterwards in the west of Libya. And we can see that red area is the area that was, within 2 weeks, controlled by the rebels, basically half the country. But Gaddafi then regrouped very, very quickly, and within the next 2 weeks had pushed the rebels back almost to where they were. Now, how did he do this? Was he using indiscriminate force against the Libyan people? The answer is simply no. And the best evidence comes from the city that had the most intense fighting, which is Misrata, which you can see up there just east of Tripoli. According to Human Rights Watch, which is no defender of Gaddafi, Human Rights Watch says that in Misrata, what percentage of the casualties were women and children? 3%. 3%. Now, if Gaddafi had been targeting the people indiscriminately, the percentage of women and children that were casualties would have been over 50%. But instead, it's 3%, which shows that Gaddafi's forces were being extremely careful to target only militants, not the civilian population. As I said, Gaddafi's forces very, very quickly pushed back the rebels so that they were basically where they had started a month prior. And they were in abject retreat to the east. They had been basically defeated in the west, and they were on the verge of defeat in Misrata. And at this point, Gaddafi's son said, quote unquote, everything will be over in 48 hours. And I think that is about right. That is about right. Certainly, by the end of March, this war would have been over. How many people would have died? Well, at that point, there were about 1,000 dead, and that includes government forces, rebels, and civilians. So if the war had gone on for a few more days, maybe about another 100 would have died. Now, what about this supposed bloodbath that was going to happen without intervention? You probably have heard that there was going to be a bloodbath in Benghazi. Well, should we believe that there was going to be a bloodbath in Benghazi? People say, well, after the rebels conquered the town, and if Gaddafi had taken it back, he would have just slaughtered people. Well, the fact is, there were other towns that the rebels had conquered and that Gaddafi had taken back. Did he slaughter people there? No. So there were at least 4 cities that he had reconquered. Zawiya and Zuwara in the west of Libya, Ajdabia in the east of Libya, and Misrata in the center of Libya, which had basically 90% retaken. In none of those towns was there a bloodbath. So if he had taken one more city, would he have committed a bloodbath there? It's possible, but there is no reason to believe that that's true. So what would have happened overall without intervention? I conclude that the war would have ended in late March. It would have been a 6-week war. There would have been 1,100 deaths. That's without intervention. What about with intervention? Well, what happened with intervention is that the rebels, rather than fleeing eastward and taking refuge in Egypt, they stood their ground, NATO bombed Gaddafi's forces, and then the rebels moved back west. Then they got stalled, then there was a little fighting in the center of the country, then they regrouped, and eventually they marched all the way to Tripoli. In August, they took the capital, Tripoli. In October, they found Gaddafi and killed him. And the war ended. At least the major combat operations of the war ended. After 8 months. So this is the outcome without intervention. This is the outcome with intervention. Rather than lasting 6 weeks, the war lasted 36 weeks. Rather than having 1,100 dead, there were in the range of 8,000 to 11,000 dead. 8,000 is a US government estimate, 11,500 is a Libyan government estimate. What else happened? Were there other positive or negative consequences of the war? Well, there were a lot of negative consequences. So first of all, there was reprisal killing by the rebels. There was ethnic cleansing of ethnic Africans, about 30 to 40,000 of them. Had Gaddafi ever done that? No, Gaddafi had never done that in his country. Human Rights Watch says these activities by the rebels we were supporting constituted, quote unquote, crimes against humanity. What else happened in Libya? Well, we have pervasive insecurity now, large-scale killing, militia control of the country. The government's not in control. Benghazi is a disaster, including the tragic killing of Ambassador Chris Stevens. We have the flourishing of radical Islam. So Gaddafi was our ally against al-Qaeda types. In his absence, in his demise, in the wake of his demise, al-Qaeda types are flourishing in eastern Libya. We also have secessionism in eastern Libya. This is destroying the oil economy, so that today in Libya, they are producing 1/6 as much oil as they were when Gaddafi was in power. 1/6. The economy is devastated. The government is not functioning. First, they kidnapped the prime minister. Then the prime minister had to flee the country. Another seemingly obscure consequence is very, very important, is that this intervention in Libya caused the destruction of the best democracy in North Africa, okay? Mali. Mali was this one sterling example of democracy in North Africa. What happened? We overthrew Gaddafi. Some of his forces fled back to their home in Mali. They allied with al-Qaeda. They overthrew the government. And what we had, according to the US Senate, was the largest safe haven in the world for al-Qaeda established in North Mali. In addition, we had proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I'm sorry, proliferation of weapons, including man-portable surface-to-air missiles, which can be used to bring down civilian aircraft and therefore, in a sense, are a weapon of mass destruction. Two more things. Syria, was Syria deterred? Was Assad deterred from using force against civilians by this intervention in Libya? It sure doesn't look like it. In fact, violence in Syria escalated in the wake of NATO intervention in Libya. What about Egypt? Well, there, the military came in and overthrew the nascent democratic flourishing of the Arab Spring. So, is this success? By Obama's own objectives. Did it protect civilians? No. It increased the death toll by about 8-fold. Did it stop the killing? No. It lengthened the war by about 6 times. Did it facilitate a transition to a legitimate government responsive to the Libyan people? There's no legitimate government, and it's not responsive to the Libyan people. Did it avert strains on the peaceful yet fragile transitions in neighboring states? No. It, in fact, led to the demise of the best democracy in North Africa. Did it prevent repressive leaders concluding that violence is the best strategy to cling to power? No. Assad went ahead and did what he was going to do, and the rulers in the military in Egypt decided to overthrow the democratically elected government. So it's in a sense maybe too soon to tell. This is only 3 years after the fact. But as of now, Karl von Clausewitz would have to conclude that the NATO intervention in Libya was an abysmal failure. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris? You're up. Yep. Thanks.